Texas is a land of wide open skies, endless roads, and hidden darkness. Beneath its charm lies a tapestry of chilling tales, stories of whispers in the night, haunted roads, cursed places, and things that should never be disturbed. Tonight, I'll share 5 of the most unsettling Texas horror stories I've ever encountered. Each tale will grip your imagination, sending shivers down your spine and making you question what's real and what's not. Are you ready to explore the shadows of Texas? Let's begin. When I was 12, there was a chain-link fence behind our house. By day, it was ordinary, rusting in spots, with a few loose links that rattled in the wind. But by night, it whispered. We had just moved to this small Texas town, a quiet neighborhood surrounded by open fields, the kind of place where nothing much happened, or so I thought. Our backyard was bordered by that fence, separating us from a strip of woods that stretched as far as I could see. My parents loved the house for its peace and quiet. I hated it, too quiet for a kid who'd grown up in the city. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. It was late, long after my parents had gone to bed. I was in my room, staring out the window at the yard, too restless to sleep. The fence looked eerie in the moonlight, its shadow stretching long across the grass. That's when I heard it, faint, almost melodic, like a soft murmuring. I opened my window, thinking it might be the trees rustling, but no, the sound was coming from the fence itself. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. The whispers were too faint to make out actual words, just a strange, rhythmic hum. My dad laughed it off, saying it was probably the wind vibrating the metal. My mum dismissed it as my imagination, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. One night, I stayed out late playing in the yard. The sun had just set, painting the sky a deep orange, and the cicadas were buzzing louder than usual. I lost track of time until the sky turned dark and the air grew cooler. That's when I heard it again. The whispers were louder this time and clearer. James! My heart stopped. That was my name. I froze, staring at the fence. Dad? I called, but my voice cracked. I glanced back at the house. No lights on, no sign of my parents. The whispers continued, soft but insistent. James, come closer. I ran inside and locked the door, my heart pounding. My dad found me sitting in the hallway, pale and shaking. When I told him what I'd heard, he gave me that same dismissive laugh. Probably just a neighbor messing around, he said. It's nothing to worry about. But I did worry, because the whispers didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, they grew louder, more distinct. The voice knew things it shouldn't. It whispered about my favorite baseball team, the name of my old school, and even the time I'd accidentally broken a lamp and blamed it on our dog, Max. Speaking of Max, he'd started acting strange too. Normally, he loved running around the backyard, but now he refused to go near the fence. Every night, he'd stand at the back door, growling low in his throat, his hackles raised. One day, a kid from the neighborhood stopped by. His name was Tyler, and he lived a few streets over. We were playing basketball in the driveway when he casually mentioned the fence. "You hear it yet?" he asked. My stomach dropped. "Hear what?" "The fence," he said, his voice low. "My sister used to hear it too, said it whispered to her. She disappeared a few years ago. They never found her." I stared at him, my throat dry. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "She was in the backyard, right by the fence," he said. "Mum said she must have run off, but I don't think so. I think the fence took her." That night, I couldn't sleep. Tyler's words kept playing in my head. I decided I had to know. I had to find out what was really going on with that fence. I waited until my parents were asleep and crept outside. The air was thick and humid, the kind of night where even breathing felt heavy. The whispers started as soon as I stepped onto the grass. "James, come closer." I inched toward the fence, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The voice was louder now, almost urgent. "James, don't be afraid." I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the cold metal. For a moment, everything went silent. The cicadas stopped buzzing, the wind stopped blowing, and even the whispers ceased. The world felt unnervingly still. Then something grabbed me. An icy hand closed around mine, pulling me against the fence. I screamed, but no sound came out. Through the chain links, I saw a shadowy figure, vague and distorted, like it wasn't fully there. Its face was a blur, but its eyes were sharp and gleaming. I yanked my hand back, stumbling away. As soon as I let go, the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, like a dozen voices talking over each other. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was inside, lying on the couch. My parents were hovering over me, their faces pale and terrified. "We found you in the yard," my mom said, her voice shaking. You were just standing there staring at the fence." I tried to explain what happened, but they didn't believe me. My dad said I must have been sleepwalking. My mom called it a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. The whispers never came back after that night. The fence was just a fence again, silent and unremarkable, but it felt different somehow, colder, even in the heat of summer. I stopped going near it. Max wouldn't even look at it. We moved away a few years later, and I never heard from Tyler again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear it, that faint rhythmic hum, and every time I do, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't let go. They warned us not to light a fire in the deep woods of Texas, but we didn't believe the stories. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, one last adventure before we all went our separate ways after college. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Marcus, and 2 girls from our group, Sarah and Tasha. We wanted something off the beaten path, a place where we could drink, laugh, and just be free from responsibilities for a little while. So, when Marcus suggested camping in the deep woods of Texas, we jumped at the idea. We stopped at a small gas station on the way to grab supplies. The cashier was an older man with leathery skin and a sharp look in his eye. As he rang us up, he asked where we were headed. "Deep woods," Marcus said casually, tossing a bag of chips onto the counter. The cashier froze, his hand halfway to the register. "You kids planning to camp out there?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah, why?" Sarah asked, sounding more curious than concerned. The man leaned in, his face serious. "Whatever you do, don't light a fire. Keep the woods dark, or you'll regret it." Marcus laughed it off as just another old man trying to scare tourists. "Thanks for the tip," he said sarcastically, and we left. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was dipping low in the sky. The forest was dense, the trees so tall they seemed to swallow the light. We found a clearing near a small stream and set up our tents. The air was cooler than expected, and the silence was almost oppressive. As night fell, we gathered some firewood and built a roaring campfire. Marcus was the first to speak up about the old man's warning. "Can you believe that guy? Don't light a fire," he said, mimicking the man's gravelly voice. "Maybe it's some weird local superstition," Tasha offered, but she sounded uneasy. We laughed it off and started telling ghost stories of our own. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. It felt like the kind of night we'd remember forever. Then we heard it. At first, it sounded like distant laughter, faint and far off, barely noticeable over the crackle of the fire. We paused, glancing at each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "It's just the wind," Marcus said, but his voice wavered. The laughter grew louder, moving through the trees as if circling us. It wasn't joyful laughter, it was mocking, almost taunting. Tasha pulled her jacket tighter around herself. "This isn't funny, Marcus. Did you invite someone out here to scare us?" "No," he said, his face pale. "I swear." Then Sarah gasped, pointing toward the tree line. "Eyes," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something out there." We all turned, squinting into the dark. For a moment, I thought she was imagining things, but then I saw them. 2 glowing eyes, just beyond the edge of the firelight. They disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the woods. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice cracking. No response. The laughter grew louder, surrounding us. It sounded like dozens of voices now, overlapping and distorted. Tasha started crying, and I felt my own hands shaking. "Let's just put out the fire and go to the tents," Sarah said, her voice desperate. But as Marcus reached for the water jug to douse the flames, the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It felt heavy, pressing down on us like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then we heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from all directions. The fire flickered wildly, as if struggling to stay alive. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. "Stay close," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why. I just knew we had to stick together. Suddenly, the fire went out. The darkness was complete, suffocating. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. Tasha screamed, and I reached out blindly, grabbing for her or anyone. My hand brushed something cold, too cold to be human. I froze. A breath, icy and damp, brushed against my neck. Then a voice, low and guttural, whispered, "You shouldn't have come." I don't remember what happened next. The next thing I knew, it was morning. I was lying in the clearing, alone. The tents were ripped to shreds, our supplies scattered. My friends were gone. I searched the woods for hours, screaming their names until my voice was raw. There was no sign of them, no footprints, no blood, nothing. When I stumbled back to the gas station, the old man was there, his face grim. "I told you not to light a fire," he said. "They're gone," I said, my voice cracking. He shook his head slowly. "They always are." No one believed me. The police said they'd keep searching, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. The townsfolk called it a tragedy, but they weren't surprised. Everyone had a story about the deep woods, people who went in and never came back, warnings ignored. I still don't know what happened that night, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night hearing faint laughter, and I swear it's calling my name. It was past midnight on a desolate Texas highway when I spotted the hitchhiker. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty, flanked by barren fields that seemed to stretch forever. I was driving home after visiting a friend in another town, the kind of trip where the silence of the road begins to play tricks on your mind. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against the windows, and the only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder, barely illuminated by my headlights. A tall figure, cloaked in shadow, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. He wasn't holding out his thumb like most hitchhikers would. He just stood there as if he'd been waiting for me specifically. My stomach churned with unease. I wasn't the kind of person to pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere. But there was something about him that made me slow down. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was guilt. What if he was in trouble? Against every ounce of common sense, I pulled over. He didn't move at first, just stood there as the red glow of my taillights painted the darkness. I rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I called out. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the emptiness around us. Without a word, he climbed into the back seat. He moved strangely, almost too fluidly, as if his joints didn't quite work the way they should. He didn't thank me or offer an explanation. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just drive," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, sending a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, but put the car in gear. As I drove, I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror. His face was mostly obscured by the hat, but I could see just enough to feel uneasy. His skin looked pale, almost grey, and his hands, resting on his knees, seemed too long, his fingers unnaturally thin. The silence was unbearable, so I tried making small talk. "Rough night?" He didn't answer. "Been out here long?" Still nothing. I gave up, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The road seemed darker now, the headlights barely piercing the night. That's when he spoke. "You've been driving this road a lot lately," he said. I froze. "How do you know that?" He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back in the seat, his face hidden even deeper in shadow. I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about my late-night trips. There was no way he could know. A few miles passed in tense silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something strange. The lights of the dashboard flickered, and the engine sputtered briefly. I tapped the gas, and the car seemed to recover, but my nerves were shot. When I glanced in the mirror again, my breath caught in my throat. He was closer. I hadn't heard him move, hadn't felt the car shift, but he was now leaning forward, his hands resting on the front seat. I could feel his presence, cold and oppressive. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I don't know," I stammered. "You didn't give me a destination." He chuckled softly, the sound low and unsettling. "You'll know soon enough." The car shuddered again, the headlights dimming briefly. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I gripped the wheel, trying to focus on the road, but it felt like the darkness was closing in. "Do you know what happens on this road?" he asked suddenly. "No," I whispered, though my throat was dry. "People disappear." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "They pick up the wrong hitchhiker, and they never make it home." The words sent a jolt of fear through me. I pressed the gas, desperate to get off the highway, but the car felt sluggish, like it was fighting against me. In the mirror, he was closer again, now leaning fully over the seat. His breath was cold, against my neck. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. I slammed on the brakes, my hands trembling. The car screeched to a halt, and I turned around to face him. But he was gone. The back seat was empty. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. I looked out into the night, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no shadow, nothing. The air felt heavy, like the darkness itself was pressing down on me. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, my heart racing the entire time. When I finally stumbled through my front door, I locked every window and door, the hitchhiker's words echoing in my mind. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I did some digging, asking around about the highway. That's when I found the stories. Countless accounts of people who'd picked up a hitchhiker fitting his description. They all reported the same thing: vague directions, unnatural movements, and the chilling realization that he knew things about them he shouldn't. And then they vanished. I don't know why I was spared that night, but I haven't driven that highway since. I can still see his shadowy figure standing on the shoulder every time I close my eyes. What about you? If you were alone on a dark highway and saw someone like him, would you stop? The church bell rang, but the building had been abandoned for years. I heard it while driving through Hollow Pines, a small, forgotten town in the middle of Texas. I wasn't supposed to be there. It was just a wrong turn on my way to an antique fair. The town itself was eerie, full of boarded-up windows and crumbling buildings. The only sign of life was the rustling of the wind through the empty streets. But it was the church that caught my attention. It stood on a hill at the edge of town, its spire piercing the grey sky. The structure was old, almost skeletal, with vines crawling up its stone walls. I'd read about it in a local history forum. A church abandoned after a series of mysterious disappearances in the 1920s. They called it cursed, but I thought it was just an old ghost story. The bell rang again, a deep, mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. I parked my car and decided to investigate. Inside, the church was cold, far colder than it should have been on a humid Texas afternoon. The air smelled of mildew and rot. The pews were broken, their wood splintered and grey with age. Graffiti covered the walls, most of it crude drawings and phrases, but one message stood out: "Leave before it's too late." I brushed it off as some bored teenager's idea of a joke and walked toward the altar. That's when I saw it, a single candle burning brightly in the center of the altar. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way someone had been here recently. The place was practically falling apart, and the road leading to it was almost impassable. I stared at the flame, transfixed, until a faint sound broke my concentration. It was music. A hymn, soft and distant, like it was being sung by a choir miles away. My rational mind told me it was the wind playing tricks, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded human. I turned around, scanning the empty building. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing back at me. No answer. Something about the altar drew me back. I leaned closer and noticed the faint outline of a compartment beneath it. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside was a small wooden box covered in dust. I opened it carefully, revealing its contents. A lock of hair tied with a red ribbon, a small hand-carved doll with hollow eyes, and an old leather-bound book. I flipped through the book, my hands trembling. It was a diary, but the entries weren't normal. They described rituals, offerings, chants, and something about binding the shadows. The more I read, the more my stomach turned. Then the bell rang again. This time, it was deafening, shaking the walls of the church. I dropped the book, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The room grew darker even though the sun was still shining outside. Shadows began creeping along the edges of the walls, pooling together as if they had a mind of their own. The air grew heavy, making it hard to breathe. I backed away from the altar, my pulse racing. "I need to get out of here," I whispered to myself. But when I turned to the door, it slammed shut with a force that made the floor vibrate. I was trapped. The shadows began to move, slithering along the floor and crawling up the walls. They seemed to ripple, taking on vague humanoid shapes. One of them reached out toward me, its hand, or what I thought was a hand, stretching unnaturally long. Panic overtook me. I ran to the nearest window, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the floor and smashing the glass. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent church. I climbed through, cutting my hands on the jagged edges, and tumbled onto the grass outside. I looked back, expecting to see those shadows chasing me. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the bell tower. It was cloaked, its face hidden, but its presence was suffocating even from a distance. It raised a hand, and the bell rang one final time. I ran to my car, not stopping until I was miles away. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I drove back to Hollow Pines, desperate to make sense of it all, but when I reached the hill, the church was gone. All that remained was a field of ash, as if the building had burned down long ago. I don't know what I saw that day, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed me home. Sometimes, at night, I hear faint hymns echoing in the distance, and every now and then I wake up to the sound of a bell ringing in the darkness. Every town has a place where kids dare each other to go. For us, it was the old well in Texas. The well sat on the outskirts of town, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rumors. It was ancient, with crumbling stones and a rusted, broken crank for the long-lost bucket. The stories about it were always the same. Anyone who looked inside the well would see their worst fear staring back at them. We were 15 when my friends and I decided to test the legend. It was a hot summer night and we were bored, restless as only teenagers can be. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Alex, and 2 others, Sam and Lily. We'd heard the stories from older kids, and now it was our turn to prove we weren't scared. Alex was the one who suggested it, his grin mischievous as always. "Come on," he said. "It's just an old hole in the ground. What's the worst that could happen?" The walk to the well was longer than I remembered. The further we went, the darker it got, until the trees around us seemed to close in. By the time we reached it, my courage had shriveled to nothing. The well looked worse than I imagined. Its stones were blackened with age, and the ground around it was littered with broken branches and shards of glass, like it had been abandoned for decades. The air smelled damp, like rot and mildew. Alex went first, of course. He sauntered up to the edge, peering over with exaggerated drama. "I see nothing but darkness," he announced, laughing. Sam followed, leaning over cautiously. He stayed there longer, his expression unreadable. "I don't see anything either," he said eventually, but his voice sounded off. Lily went next. She hesitated at the edge, her hands gripping the stones. After a moment, she stepped back, shaking her head. "It's just a well," she said quietly. Though she wouldn't look any of us in the eye, then it was my turn. I approached the well slowly, my heart pounding. The air around it felt colder, and I swear I could hear a faint hum coming from inside. When I finally stood at the edge and looked down, the darkness felt alive, like it was reaching for me. "See anything?" Alex asked, his voice teasing. I wanted to say no, but I couldn't. Something was moving in the shadows, shifting just out of view. It wasn't clear enough to make out, but it felt wrong. My chest tightened, and my legs locked up, refusing to step back. Then I felt it. A pull. It wasn't physical, but something in the darkness was drawing me closer, urging me to lean in. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my body wouldn't listen. The shadows seemed to ripple, and for a moment I thought I saw a face, distorted, hollow-eyed, and grinning. Alex grabbed my arm and yanked me back. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice serious for once. I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." We left the well that night, but I couldn't shake the image of that face. Over the next few days, things got worse. It started with whispers, faint and barely audible, like someone was speaking just behind me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but they followed me everywhere, in the halls at school, in my room at night, even in the shower. Then, objects started moving on their own. I'd find my keys on the floor, even though I'd left them on my desk. My closet door would swing open in the middle of the night, creaking as if someone was standing there, waiting. The nightmares were the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the well. I was falling into it, the darkness swallowing me whole. And at the bottom, that face was waiting for me, grinning as it pulled me deeper. One night, I woke up outside, standing in my backyard. I don't remember getting out of bed, let alone walking outside, but there I was, barefoot and freezing, staring at something impossible. The well was there, in my backyard. Its stones were just as blackened and crumbling as before, but it shouldn't have been there. It couldn't have been. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was still dreaming, but the cold air biting at my skin told me otherwise. That's when I heard it. "Come back!" The voice was faint, but unmistakable, echoing from the well. My blood ran cold as the shadows inside began to shift, forming that same hollow-eyed face. I ran inside, locking every door and window, but the whispers followed me. By the next morning, I knew I had to go back. I didn't tell my friends. They wouldn't have believed me, and honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I couldn't live like this anymore. Whatever was haunting me, I had to face it. The walk to the well was different this time. The forest felt darker, the air heavier, as if the trees themselves were trying to keep me out. When I reached the clearing, the well seemed to be waiting for me. I approached cautiously, the hum growing louder with every step. The shadows inside were alive now, writhing like smoke. "I'm here," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadows rose, forming a shape, a figure with long, spindly limbs and that same grinning face. It reached out toward me, its hand impossibly long. I stumbled back, but the pull was stronger this time. My feet wouldn't obey me, and the figure kept coming closer, its grin widening. "No!" I screamed, forcing myself to move. In a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back home. When I finally looked back, the well was gone, as if it had never existed. I thought I'd escaped, but deep down, I know I left something behind. The whispers are quieter now, but they're still there, a faint reminder of what I saw. And sometimes, when I pass a shadowy corner or a darkened room, I feel it watching me. A piece of me stayed with the well that night, and whatever's there, it's still waiting. Have you ever faced a dare you regretted? Tell me in the comments what happened. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the scares coming. And if you have your own story to share, send it to us. You might just see it featured in a future video. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and never underestimate the power of the unknown.